You grew up too fast. The hidden cost of being the child who never got to be one. There is a particular kind of tiredness that has nothing to do with sleep. It lives underneath the ribs, in the jaw you didn't know you'd been clenching since you were 9 years old. It is the tiredness of someone who's been working since before they had the words for work. If you have ever felt exhausted in a way rest doesn't touch, if you have ever wondered why other adults move through life with a lightness you never learned, this is for you. Somewhere in your childhood, a shift happened that no one announced. No ceremony, no sentence spoken aloud that said your job now is to hold this family together. And yet you understood it anyway, the way children understand things that are never said directly. You became watchful, useful, long before you were ready, the person other people leaned on. And somewhere in that becoming, the child you were supposed to be stepped aside and never fully came back. This is not a story about a broken home, though for some of you it might be. It is a story about a role handed to certain children not out of cruelty but because someone in the house needed a steadying presence, and you happened to be the one who noticed. Noticing, it turns out, is dangerous. Once you notice, you cannot unnotice. And a child who notices too much becomes a child who starts managing what they were never meant to manage. Maybe for you it was a parent's illness, or their addiction, or their absence, physical or emotional. Maybe it was a divorce that turned you into a messenger between two worlds, or a younger sibling who became your responsibility while you were still learning to tie your own shoes. Maybe nothing dramatic ever happened at all, and that is what makes your exhaustion so confusing now. Because there is no single story you can point to, only the steady accumulation of being needed more than you were held. What we are going to explore together is not blame. It is recognition. The recognition of a nervous system that adapted so early and so that it forgot there was ever another option. We are going to trace exactly what happened inside you, why it still shapes the way you love, work, rest, and relate to your own needs today, and most importantly, what it takes to give that child, still inside you, the childhood they never fully got to finish. The day you stopped being a child. There is rarely one single day. That is the strange cruelty of it. If there had been one dramatic moment, one clear before and after, it might have been easier to name, easier to grieve, easier to point to and say, that is where it happened. Instead, it was smaller than that. It was 100 quiet moments stacked on top of each other until one day you looked up and realized you had stopped asking for things. Maybe it was the tone in a parent's voice that told you, before any words, that today was not a day for your needs. Maybe it was an argument through a wall, and you learning to read the silence afterward like weather. Maybe it was being the oldest, the one whose maturity was so convenient that no one asked what it was costing you. Whatever the shape, the function was the same. You learned, far too early, to scan the emotional temperature of a room before you scanned your own feelings. This scanning is not a personality trait. It is a survival adaptation. A child's brain, placed in an environment where the adults are unpredictable, overwhelmed, or emotionally unsafe, does something remarkable and heartbreaking at once. It reorganizes itself around managing the environment instead of existing in it. Play becomes secondary. Curiosity becomes secondary. Even rest becomes something to be earned. The child essentially trades their own development for the family's stability. What makes this so difficult to see later in life is that it looked, from the outside, like strength. Adults praised you for it. Teachers called you mature for your age. Relatives said things like, "She's so responsible, he's such an old soul," as if premature responsibility were a gift rather than a wound wearing a costume. And you, being a child who needed approval like any child does, learned to perform that maturity even more convincingly, because it was the only currency that reliably earned you love. Here is the quiet tragedy underneath all of it. You did not stop being a child because childhood ended. You stopped being a child because it became unsafe in some subtle and continuous way to remain one. And a part of you has been waiting ever since, for someone to notice that the performance was never the whole truth. The invisible job. No one ever gave you. Every parentified child eventually takes on a role, and the strange part is that no one ever formally offers it to them. There is no conversation, no negotiation, no moment where anyone sits you down and says, "From now on, part of your job is to manage the emotional atmosphere of this household." It accumulates task by task, glance by glance, until the role has fully formed around you and you can no longer remember a version of yourself without it. Sometimes the job was practical, managing siblings, managing the household when a parent was absent, unwell, or emotionally unavailable. Sometimes the job was almost invisible, emotional labor with no name, where your task was to be the regulated one, the one whose steadiness kept everyone else from falling apart. Either way, the effect is nearly identical. You become hyper-attuned to the needs of others because your own safety depended on their stability. What is easy to miss, from inside that role, is how much it asks of a body still developing. A child's brain is not built to hold adult-level responsibility, adult-level vigilance. And yet many children do exactly this, quietly, for years, without a single adult realizing the size of what they are carrying. The child does not complain, because complaining was never modeled as safe. The child adapts, and adapting looks from the outside remarkably like coping well. But coping well and being well are not the same thing. A child coping well has learned to suppress the parts of themselves that would otherwise ask for help. A child being well never needed to learn that suppression. The difference between these two children is invisible on the surface and enormous underneath. And it is this difference that follows people into their 30s, 40s, and beyond, disguised as competence, disguised as independence, disguised as being the reliable one. Why you became the calm one. In almost every parentified story, there is a version of you who became known, within the family system, as the calm one, the steady one, the one who didn't make things harder. This label feels in the moment like praise, but underneath it is something much more complicated, a role assignment that asks you to regulate not just your own emotions, but the emotional climate of everyone around you. Children become the calm one for a specific reason. Somewhere in the household there was already too much dysregulation. Into that instability, a child instinctively senses that adding their own big feelings would be one thing too many. So they don't. They swallow the tears, flatten the frustration, present a version of themselves that requires nothing extra from an already depleted system. And slowly, that presentation stops feeling like a performance and starts feeling like personality. This is one of the most disorienting parts of growing up too fast. The mask fuses to the face. You stop being able to tell where the coping strategy ends and where you begin. Ask a parentified adult what they feel in a moment of stress, and many of them will genuinely not know. Not because they are avoidant by nature, but because the pathway between sensation and articulation was interrupted so early and so consistently that it never fully developed. Being the calm one carries a hidden cruelty. It means your distress when it surfaces is often met with confusion or even irritation, because people built their expectations on the version of you that never needed anything. You broke a silent contract by having a bad day. And so, to keep the peace, to keep the role intact, you learned to have your hardest moments alone, in rooms with the door closed, where your steadiness could crack without an audience. But what exactly were the terms of that contract and who wrote them? The silent contract you never signed. Every parentified child operates under an agreement they never consciously made. It is not written anywhere. No one reads it aloud. And yet you can feel its terms in your body every time you try to rest, every time you catch yourself apologizing for a need before you finished stating it. The terms are simple and brutal. Your worth is conditional on your usefulness. Your safety is conditional on your compliance. Your right to be cared for is conditional on how well you care for everyone else first. This contract was not written by a villain. Most of the time it was written, unintentionally, by adults who were themselves overwhelmed, under-resourced, or unhealed from their own childhoods. They were not trying to exploit you. They were often drowning. And you, a small and perceptive creature, reached out and became a life raft, because that felt more bearable than watching them sink. Understanding this does not erase the cost. It helps explain why the pattern happened without anyone intending harm. What makes this contract so persistent is that it was ratified through relief rather than through punishment. Every time you managed a crisis and the household calmed down, every time your composure prevented a bigger blow-up, you received a hit of something that felt like safety. The tension dropped. The house exhaled. And your nervous system, still forming its blueprint for how relationships work, filed this away as evidence. This is how I create peace. This is how I earn my place. This is how I keep people close. Decades later, that same contract still runs in the background of your adult relationships at work, in friendships, in romance. You overfunction without being asked. You feel a strange, low-grade dread at the idea of receiving care without earning it first. And somewhere underneath the competence and the reliability, there is a tired, unacknowledged part of you that has never once been asked, gently and sincerely, "What do you need?" without an agenda attached to the answer. What happens to a nervous system that never got to rest? Rest for most children is a default state. It is what happens between the bursts of play, the natural rhythm of a body that has not yet learned to brace against the world. But for a parentified child, rest becomes something else entirely. It becomes a risk. Because to truly rest, you have to lower your vigilance, and lowering your vigilance in a household that required constant scanning meant missing something important, something that could cost you or someone you loved dearly. So instead of learning genuine rest, you learned something that looked like rest from the outside, but functioned differently inside. You learned to be still while remaining alert, to close your eyes while part of your mind kept listening for footsteps, for raised voices, for the creak of a door that told you whether tonight would be calm. This is not relaxation. This is vigilance wearing the disguise of stillness, and a nervous system that practices this for years does not switch it off once the environment changes. This is why so many parentified adults describe a specific, maddening inability to relax, even when nothing is wrong. They can be on a beach in a quiet house, surrounded by safety, and still feel an underlying hum of readiness, as if some part of them is waiting for the next thing to manage. That hum is not a personality flaw. It is a nervous system doing exactly what it was trained to do for years, faithfully, tirelessly, because at some point that vigilance kept you and your family safer. The tragedy is that this system, so brilliantly adapted for childhood survival, becomes a liability in adulthood, where most environments do not require constant threat detection. The body, however, does not automatically know the difference between then and now. It continues running the old program, burning through cortisol and adrenaline for dangers that mostly no longer exist, leaving you fatigued in a way that has no obvious cause, exhausted by a life that, on paper, looks stable. Healing this does not mean forcing yourself to relax through sheer willpower. It means slowly, patiently teaching your nervous system, through repeated safe experiences, that stillness will not cost you anything this time. That is a process measured in months and years, not in a single deep breath. And understanding that is often the first real relief a parentified adult experiences, because it finally explains why relaxing has always felt so unnaturally hard. The emotions you learned to skip, somewhere along the way, certain emotions stopped being an option for you. Not because you didn't feel them, but because feeling them fully was unsafe given the role you were playing. Anger was often the first to go because anger in a child who was supposed to be easy, supposed to be no trouble at all, threatened the entire arrangement. So anger got rerouted, buried, transformed into something quieter and more acceptable, like over-responsibility or perfectionism. Sadness suffered a similar fate. A child managing a household in crisis rarely has the luxury of falling apart, because falling apart means someone else has to catch you, and there was often no one available to do that catching. So sadness got postponed indefinitely, filed away for a later that never quite arrived, until it calcified into something closer to a low, persistent numbness than an emotion you could name and release. Even joy, strangely enough, sometimes got rationed. A child who is constantly monitoring the emotional temperature of a room learns to keep their own excitement small, because big joy can feel jarring, even threatening, in a house already teetering on instability. Better to stay neutral. Better to stay measured. Better to keep your emotional range narrow enough that it never disrupts the fragile balance you've worked so hard to maintain. What you were left with instead was a narrow, functional emotional bandwidth, wide enough to get through the day, competent enough to handle whatever came next, but missing the full spectrum that a person's inner life is supposed to include. And when, as an adult, someone asks you a simple question like, "How are you feeling right now?" You may find yourself genuinely unable to answer, not from avoidance, but because the pathway that would normally deliver that answer was decommissioned decades ago. Rebuilding access to that full range is slow, deliberate work. It often starts with the smallest, most physical signals, a tightness in the chest, a heaviness in the limbs, before it ever becomes a word you can say out loud. Learning to feel again after years of skipping is not weakness. It is one of the most demanding forms of courage there is. Why you can't relax even now. You have built, by most external measures, a life that should allow for rest. Maybe you have stability, a career, people who love you, a home that is objectively safe. And yet the moment you sit still, something in you starts looking for the next task, the next problem, the next person who might need you. This is one of the most confusing symptoms of a parentified past because logically, there is nothing left to manage. And yet the managing never fully stops. Part of this comes from a simple but painful truth. Your sense of safety was never built on circumstance, it was built on control. As a child, control over the small things you could influence, other people's moods, the household's stability, your own performance, felt like the only lever available to prevent chaos. That lever became so deeply wired into your definition of safety that even now, in a life with far less actual danger, your body still equates control with survival and stillness with risk. This is why productivity can feel, for parentified adults, less like a choice and more like a compulsion. Being busy quiets the anxious hum. Achieving something, finishing something, fixing something, gives you a temporary, familiar sense of having earned your right to exist for another day. Rest, by contrast, offers no such proof. It leaves you alone with a body that has forgotten how to be, without performing, without producing, without justifying its presence. There is also a quieter, more painful layer underneath the restlessness. Rest requires trust. Trust that the world will not fall apart the moment you stop watching it. Trust that you are allowed to exist without constantly earning your place in it. For someone whose earliest experience of the world taught the opposite lesson, that trust is not something you decide to have. It has to be rebuilt, slowly, through repeated proof that stopping does not lead to disaster. This is not a flaw to be fixed quickly. It is a deeply intelligent adaptation that has simply outlived its usefulness, and recognizing that difference between what once kept you safe and what now keeps you exhausted is often the real beginning of learning how to rest. But before rest becomes possible, there is a feeling standing guard in front of it, one that shows up the moment anyone tries to take care of you. The guilt of wanting to be taken care of. There is a particular flavor of guilt that only parentified people seem to know intimately. The guilt that arrives the moment you want, even briefly, to be the one who is taken care of instead of the one doing the caretaking. It shows up as a flinch when someone offers to help you. It shows up as a reflexive, "I'm fine, I've got it," before the other person has even finished their sentence. It shows up as discomfort so sharp that receiving feels almost more uncomfortable than continuing to give. This guilt did not appear randomly. It was built methodically by a childhood in which your needs were consistently, even if unintentionally, deprioritized. When a child repeatedly learns that expressing a need results in disappointment, extra burden on already overwhelmed adults, or no response at all, the child eventually stops registering the need as legitimate. It becomes easier, safer to redirect that energy outward, toward taking care of others, where at least the effort produces a visible, appreciated result. Over time, giving becomes not just a habit, but an identity. You are the one people call. You are the one who shows up. You are the one who remembers everyone's birthday, everyone's hard week, everyone's unspoken need, while assuming that your own needs are either too much or beside the point. And when someone finally does try to reciprocate that care, a strange discomfort rises. Not because you don't want it, but because receiving threatens the entire identity you built your safety around. This is why so many parentified adults find it genuinely difficult to accept a compliment, a gift, help with something they are perfectly capable of doing alone, or even simple emotional comfort during a hard time. It is not modesty. It is an old protective belief that being needy in any form is dangerous. and that the only safe way to exist in relationship with others is as the giver, never the receiver. Undoing this pattern does not happen through a single act of self-care. It happens through repeated small, uncomfortable moments of allowing yourself to receive anyway, of staying present with the discomfort instead of deflecting it, until your nervous system slowly learns a new, gentler truth, that being cared for does not have to be earned, and that you were always allowed to need things too. How you became everyone else's safe place. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from being the person everyone else turns to. The friend who gets the 3 a.m. texts, the family member who mediates every conflict, the partner who somehow always ends up managing both people's emotions in the relationship. If this is familiar, it is not a coincidence. It is the direct continuation of a role you were trained for long before you had any say in the matter. Children who grow up managing an unstable environment develop an uncanny sensitivity to the emotional states of others. Forged under pressure, it does not disappear once childhood ends. It follows you into every relationship, scanning for distress, stepping in before anyone has asked, because stepping in early was, for years, the only way to prevent things from getting worse. You became fluent in a language most people never had to learn, anticipating what others need before they can articulate it themselves. This fluency makes you remarkable to be around. People feel deeply understood by you, deeply held, deeply safe. But there is a cost hidden inside that gift, because a person who is always reading the room rarely gets read in return. You become so skilled at holding space for others that people forget, or never learn, to hold space for you. Your own emotional weather goes largely unmonitored, not because people don't care, but because you have trained them, without meaning to expect that you will always be the steady one. This dynamic tends to repeat itself relentlessly, in friendships that feel one-sided, in romantic relationships where you do the emotional heavy lifting for both people, in family systems where you remain the designated fixer well into adulthood. Recognizing this pattern is not about assigning blame to the people around you. It is about recognizing that you were never taught how to ask for reciprocity, because reciprocity was never modeled for you. Becoming someone else's safe place is a beautiful capacity, but you were also always allowed to have one of your own, a place, a person, a relationship where you are permitted to be the one who needs holding, without having to earn it first through years of quiet service. The child who learned to read a room before learning to read. Long before you could read words on a page, you were already fluent in a far more demanding language. The shifting expressions on a parent's face, the subtle change in someone's breathing before an argument, the particular silence that meant trouble was coming. This is a form of literacy few people ever talk about, and it develops earliest and most intensely in children who grow up in unpredictable environments, because for them, reading the room accurately was not a party trick. It was a survival skill. This kind of hyper-attunement comes at a real developmental cost. The mental and emotional resources a child pours into monitoring their environment are resources that are not available for the ordinary business of childhood: unstructured play, simple curiosity, the freedom to be bored without consequence. A brain that is busy scanning for danger is a brain that has less bandwidth left over for wonder. And so, quietly, without anyone deciding it should happen this way, wonder gets crowded out by watchfulness. As an adult, this shows up in ways that can look, on the surface, like strength. You are perceptive. You notice things others miss, the slight edge in someone's voice, the tension building before a conflict erupts, the exact moment a conversation is about to turn. Friends and colleagues often rely on this perceptiveness, calling you intuitive, calling you emotionally intelligent, without realizing that this ability was forged under duress, not chosen freely as a gift. The exhausting part is that this scanning rarely turns off. It runs in meetings, in casual conversations, in rooms that pose no actual threat, because the system that built it was never given the all clear to stand down. You are, in a very real sense, still reading a room that stopped requiring translation a long time ago. And that same scanning system, pointed at your own achievements, produces one of the strangest symptoms of this entire pattern. The one we look at next. Why success never feels like enough. Many parentified people become remarkably capable adults, the ones who excel at work, who manage complex responsibilities with apparent ease, who others describe as impressively put together. And yet, privately, success rarely feels the way it is supposed to feel. There is achievement but not satisfaction. There is recognition but not relief. The finish line keeps moving no matter how much ground you cover. This happens because achievement for a parentified person was never about accomplishment. It was tied to worth. If your value was measured by your usefulness, then achievement became a form of ongoing proof, evidence you had to keep generating to justify your place in the world. And proof, unlike genuine self-worth, is never permanent. It has to be renewed constantly, which is exactly why one accomplishment rarely satisfies for long before the anxious search for the next one begins. This also explains why rest after success can feel almost unbearable. A goal completed should, in theory, create space to celebrate, to exhale, to enjoy what has been built. But for someone whose safety was always tied to output, stillness after achievement can trigger the same old alarm: if I am not producing something right now, am I still valuable? Am I still safe? So instead of resting in the accomplishment, you reach for the next task, robbing yourself of the satisfaction you worked so hard to earn. Underneath all of this is a quiet, aching belief that has never been directly challenged, the belief that you are only as good as your last contribution. This belief was installed early, reinforced consistently, and rarely examined, because examining it would mean confronting a much harder question: who am I when I am not being useful to someone? Learning to answer that question honestly, without immediately filling the silence with another task, is uncomfortable, disorienting, and absolutely necessary if success is ever going to feel like something other than a treadmill you cannot step off of. The loneliness of being competent. There is a specific, rarely discussed loneliness that comes from being extremely capable. People assume you are fine because you always seem fine. They assume you don't need checking in on because you never seem to need anything. Over time, this assumption hardens into a kind of quiet isolation, not because people don't care about you, but because your own competence has convinced them, and sometimes even yourself, that you don't require the same support everyone else openly asks for. This loneliness is particularly cruel because it is largely self-inflicted, not out of malice, but out of years of training. You learned early that showing struggle invited complication, extra worry for already overwhelmed adults, confusion from people who expected competence rather than vulnerability. So you hid the struggle. You got very good at hiding it. And the better you got, the more convincingly the world believed you never needed anyone. The result is a strange paradox many parentified adults live inside, surrounded by people, yet rarely truly seen by any of them. Your struggles remain private, processed alone, in the same closed rooms where you once learned to let your composure crack without an audience. Even close relationships can carry this distance, because the muscle of asking for help, genuinely, transparently, without minimizing the need first, was never given the chance to develop. Breaking this isolation requires something that feels deeply counterintuitive, deliberately allowing yourself to be seen as less capable than you are, at least occasionally, at least with the people who have earned that trust. It means tolerating the discomfort of someone worrying about you, of someone stepping in before you've proven you truly need it. It is uncomfortable because it goes against everything your younger self learned to keep everyone safe. But connection, real connection, cannot survive on competence alone. It requires need, expressed honestly, received without judgment. And before you can offer that to another person, there is something your body has been holding all these years that has to be listened to first. What your body remembers that your mind forgot. The mind is remarkably good at reframing the past. It can tell a coherent story: it's fine, it wasn't that bad, other people had it worse. Plenty of protective narratives that helped you survive and move forward. But the body keeps a different record, one that is far less interested in narrative and far more interested in raw, unfiltered sensation. And often it is the body that reveals what the mind has decided to forget. This is why so many parentified adults carry chronic tension in specific places: the shoulders, the jaw, the stomach, without an obvious present-day cause. These are not random aches. They are the physical residue of years spent in a state of low-grade alert, a body that braced so consistently for so long that bracing became its default posture. The mind may have stopped consciously reliving the past, but the muscles never got the memo that the danger has passed. The body also remembers in behavioral ways. A flinch at raised voices, even friendly ones. A racing heart at unexpected phone calls. A wave of dread before checking messages from a certain family member. These reactions rarely make logical sense in the present, and that is the clue. When a reaction feels disproportionate to the situation, the body is not responding to now. It is responding to then, using the present moment as a trigger for an old, unprocessed memory. Working with these responses requires a different approach than thinking your way out of them. Insight alone rarely calms a nervous system that learned its lessons somatically, through years of lived tension rather than through words. Healing often has to happen through the body as well, through practices that help you notice sensation without panic, that slowly teach your system a new, safer experience to file alongside the old one. Your body was never being dramatic. It was being loyal, faithfully protecting you using the only information it had. Information gathered a very long time ago, in circumstances that no longer exist, and it deserves gratitude for that loyalty, even as you gently teach it that the threat has passed. Learning to need without apologizing. Somewhere along the way, needing something became, for you, synonymous with being a burden. This belief rarely arrives all at once. It builds slowly, through 1,000 small moments where a need was met with a sigh, a delay, an unspoken but unmistakable message that your want was, in some way, inconvenient. Over time, you learn to preempt that discomfort by apologizing before the need was even fully expressed, softening every request until it barely resembled a request at all. This habit of apologetic needing shows up everywhere in adulthood. You soften requests at work until they sound like suggestions. You downplay physical pain until it becomes undeniable. You hesitate to ask a partner for reassurance, wrapping the ask in so many disclaimers that its weight nearly disappears. Sorry to bother you. It's probably nothing. You don't have to if it's a hassle. These are not just polite phrases. They are the linguistic fingerprints of a childhood that taught you needing was dangerous. The deeper truth underneath this pattern is simple and difficult to accept. Everyone has needs. Needing things is not a personal failing. It is a basic feature of being human. What made your needs feel dangerous was never the needs themselves. It was an environment that was too depleted, too unstable, or too unaware to reliably meet them. That environment's limitations became, unfairly, internalized as evidence about your own worthiness to need things. Learning to need without apologizing does not happen overnight, and it rarely happens through insight alone. It happens through small, repeated experiments, stating a need plainly, without softening it into oblivion, and staying present through the discomfort that follows even when no disaster occurs. Each time this happens and the world does not collapse, a small piece of the old belief begins to loosen. You were never a burden for needing things. You were a child in an environment that could not always meet you, and those are two entirely different truths, even though for years they have felt exactly the same. Becoming the child you never got to be. There is no version of this story where you get your literal childhood back. The years are gone, spent doing work that was never yours to do, carrying weight that was never yours to carry. Grieving that loss honestly, without rushing past it toward a tidy resolution, is not indulgent. It is necessary. You are allowed to mourn the version of yourself who never got to be simply, uncomplicatedly young. But grief is not the only thing available to you here. Because the part of you that never got to finish growing up in safety is not gone. It is waiting, patiently, underneath the competence and the vigilance and the careful management of everyone else's needs. That part still wants what every child wants: to be curious without consequence, to rest without earning it, to be cared for without performing for it first. And remarkably, it is never too late to begin offering that child what they were missing. This does not require some dramatic reinvention of your life. It often begins in small, almost embarrassingly simple ways, letting yourself do something purely because it is enjoyable, with no productive outcome required, allowing someone to take care of you without immediately reciprocating out of guilt, noticing tension in your body, and choosing, deliberately, to soften instead of push through. Saying a need out loud and resisting the urge to apologize for it in the same breath. Slowly, through these small, repeated acts, you begin teaching your nervous system a new possibility, one it was never offered the first time around, that safety does not require constant vigilance, that love does not have to be earned through usefulness, that you are allowed to simply exist, unburdened without justifying your presence through what you provide for everyone else. You grew up too fast because the situation demanded it, not because you deserved to lose that time, and while that time cannot be returned, the qualities it took from you, spontaneity, rest, the freedom to need without shame, can still be rebuilt, patiently, deliberately, starting now, with the same quiet strength that got you through everything else. The child you never got to be is not lost. They have been waiting for you to finally come back for them.